Welcome, everyone, to the University of Chicago Law School's discussion series on policing. This is the second of our 7 sessions. Our usual moderator and host, Professor Emily Buss, is traveling at the moment and will not be able to join us in full. She will return next week and every other week of the series. I'm Richard McAdams, recently Deputy Dean of the Law School and professor here since 2007. I will be the moderator and host today. One of the law school's primary areas of academic research and clinical advocacy has been reforming the police. The goal of this series is to give our faculty the opportunity to share their work and to give our community the chance to discuss how these ideas relate to current efforts to reform policing. Our specific topic today is civilian control and discipline of police, public and private. Our 2 expert panelists are Professor Sharon Fairley and Professor Jonathan Masur. I will invite each of them to make some opening remarks, and while they're doing so, you may use the chat function at the bottom of your screen to propose to me questions for the speakers. We'll begin Q&A at around 12:30 p.m. I'm pleased to introduce our first speaker, Professor from Practice Sharon Fairley. Professor Fairley earned a degree in mechanical and aerospace engineering at Princeton University, an MBA from Wharton, and most importantly, perhaps, a law degree from the University of Chicago. Before joining the law school, Professor Fairley worked as a federal prosecutor with the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Northern District of Illinois, and as the first Deputy Inspector General and General Counsel for the City of Chicago. In December 2015, following the Chicago police officers Jason Van Dyke's shooting murder of Laquan McDonald, Professor Fairley was appointed to serve as the Chief Administrator of the Independent Police Review Authority, IPRA, the agency responsible for investigating CPD misconduct. When the city decided to replace that organization with an entirely new one, Professor Fairley was put in charge of creating and building Chicago's new Civilian Office of Police Accountability, COPA. Professor Fairley has taught at the law school since 2015, specializing in legal ethics, criminal procedure, public corruption, and policing. And so now, Professor Fairley.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today, and welcome. I'm really, really excited to have the opportunity to spend some time talking about civilian oversight of law enforcement. It's become an area of practice that's really, really interesting to me personally, since I had a chance to work in this space for a couple years, and I've had the opportunity to see the good, the bad, and the ugly. So I thought what I'd do is kind of start a little bit with kind of a background with where civilian oversight came from and what is its purpose, or what is its point. And so Richard, if you could go to the first slide. That's the last slide, if you want to back up a little bit. Okay, so if you could go click one more slide. Okay, and now click one more time. So when we think about the factors that influence police accountability, right? So first of all, the first level of influence is that internal influence. So the internal mechanisms within a police department that foster accountability. So these would be the policies and the rules and the disciplinary systems. Now, Richard, if you could click twice. Thank you. Then we have the external factors, right? So the external factors that are pushing inward on a department to try to foster more accountability. We have the political factors, so influence from the political process and political leaders. We have the legal constraints that really push back and try to constrain police misconduct. And then, of course, there's the public. There's public concern about what happens when these incidents happen. And so there's public pressure to make police officers more accountable. So where does civilian oversight fit in? And Richard, if you could click one more time. It's really kind of this entity that sort of sits in the middle. So it is a factor that is external to the police department. So that's really important. It has to be independent of the police department, but it's also got to reflect the influence of the community that it serves. So, and now Richard, if you could go to the next slide. When I first started working in civilian oversight, I kind of thought of it as kind of a newfangled thing when it came to police accountability, but it's not. I mean, it's been around for decades. And in fact, if you look back historically, even here in Chicago, there have been civilians who've been involved in overseeing the way the police department conducts itself from as early as the early 1900s. Back in 1911 to 1915, there were civilian inspectors that were actually responsible for going out and investigating complaints of misconduct. But when we look towards what happened, the more formal creation of civilian oversight systems, they really started to be created in the middle of the century. So in the mid-1900s, there were the creation of police commissions. If you think about Los Angeles as a police commission, it's a group of individuals who are actually responsible for running the police department. And those were created because they wanted to wrest control of policing away from the hands of politicians and to create and make a more independent oversight of policing. The first actual civilian oversight board that wasn't a police commission was established in 1948 in Washington, D.C. And at the time, Washington was actually led by a 3-person panel and didn't have a mayor. And those 3 people were all white. And of course, we had a predominantly black city. There was a big misconduct case that happened where a young black man was accused of a crime and then was beaten up in lockup. And there was public outcry over this. And so this entity was first created to help foster more accountability in Washington, D.C. The next entity that came online was the New York City's Civil Complaint Review Board. That's actually the oldest civilian oversight agency that continues to exist today. Then we have here in Chicago, our first was the creation of the Chicago Police Board in 1960, which also was created in the wake of a scandal. That scandal was the Somerdale scandal, where a bunch of officers were involved in supporting the work of a burglar. And when he was caught, he wrote a 77-page confession and he took everybody down with him. So Richard, if you could then go to the next slide. And then of course, civilian oversight expanded and proliferated over the next several decades, where it really became a movement that accelerated. And we saw different kinds of oversight being developed in jurisdictions all across the United States. And more recently, we've seen the type of civilian oversight become way more sophisticated, where the powers that these entities have are enhanced, and we're seeing multi-layered systems being developed over time. And if you could go to the next slide, please. So one of the reasons, one of the pieces of research that I did last year was I was really curious about how our system of Chicago fared relative to what was going on elsewhere in the country. So what I did was I took a look at the most populous, so the top 100 US cities, and I looked at the civilian oversight entities that existed across the country in those cities to see how prevalent civilian oversight was and what kinds of civilian oversight were more often used in the city. So looking at that, among those 100 cities, about 61 or 61% had at least some form of civilian oversight in place. And if you go to the next slide, Richard. The civilian oversight is definitely more prevalent the larger the city is. So if you look at the top tier, so the top third of those cities, the top 33 cities, about 88% of those cities have some form of civilian oversight. So again, it's much more prevalent. The larger the city is, the more likely they are to have civilian oversight. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. And so there are different types of civilian oversight. There's review, there's the investigative model, advisory model, where you have appeals, where you can appeal from a decision. There's the supervisory model, which tends to be the police commissions. There's the adjudicative model, like the Chicago Police Board, that actually adjudicates individual cases. And then there's the audit model. And so this shows the prevalence of the types or forms of civilian oversight in those 100 cities. Next slide, please. So what's really happening, what's interesting, what's more happening more recently is the idea of these large commissions that have policy control. And so we see a couple of cities where that's really just being established in the last year. And so it'll be interesting to see how these entities perform. There's one in Oakland. So there's they created their own police commission that really sets department policy. And but it also gave this entity the power to fire the police chief, which has become a very, very important issue, a very controversial issue in the world of civilian oversight recently. And again, this board has been the first to actually exercise that power. So there's a controversy going on right now because the board did in fact hire a police superintendent that had recently been hired, and her Chief Ann Kirkpatrick. And this has created a bit of a disruption in the city because the officers were really supporting her. And so it'll be interesting to see how this situation plays out over time. Next slide, please. Seattle most recently also formed a commission. And so theirs is coming online more recently. They had a group that was formed coming out of a consent decree. And now they are formalizing this more formal structure of oversight, where we have a body that not only sees the police department, but also oversees the investigative agency and also their inspector general. So this is a broad body that oversees the whole police accountability system. And so that's kind of the trend that we're seeing going forward. And again, here in Chicago, if you could go to the next slide, we have a proposal, we have a proposal on the table about creating one of those for Chicago. And so out of the reforms in 2016, after the Laquan McDonald crisis, one of the recommendations was that we create an oversight structure like this. And so there have been a few proposals that have been worked on over the course of these intervening years. And so Richard, if you could go to the next slide. So what the concept that's really on the table right now is that we would have an elected council, which would be the first time we would have an elected body that's responsible for overseeing our police department here in Chicago. These members would be elected to 4-year terms, and there would be one member for 2 districts in the city. The criteria for membership is no prior law enforcement experience, and these would be based on nonpartisan elections. But the key question about this entity that's to be created is, what is it supposed to be doing? What are its powers? So Richard, if you could go to the next slide. So the current version that's at the city council today starts with the idea of appointing the superintendent, the chief of the Civilian Office of Police Accountability, and the police board members. And if you see on the slide, I crossed out fire and supervise, because the original proposal that had been brought to the table was that the entity would have that power. And I believe that that controversy has been resolved now. And so right now, what's before the city council is that this entity would merely have the power to appoint, but not the power to fire. So we'll see if that controversy continues. The biggest thing, I think, that the reason why they want to create this entity is policy approval. The idea here is that we want more community involvement in determining how our policing services are administered and how police operations are handled. And so having an entity that can actually have a formal say in policy has been a real desire of people who want to reform the department. And that's really a big part of it. Some of the other powers would be budget approval, and then reviewing disciplinary investigations and being able to direct the investigations of the Civilian Office of Police Accountability. And so this is a big question. We'll see how far this proposal goes forward in the City Council. But this is the current status of the ordinance that's before the council right now. One more slide, please, Richard. How am I doing for time?
2 minutes.
Okay, so, civilian oversight is not without its challenges. And from the very, very beginning, there's been a lot of pushback against the creation of civilian oversight entities. Much of that pushback tends to be led by the police unions and the law enforcement community itself. And so oftentimes, these entities have to be created. There has to be a coalition that creates the political power that is strong enough to overcome this opposition that you're seeing from the unions and the law enforcement community. So we've seen a lot of pushback. For example, last year in Tennessee, there was enough support within the opposition that they actually passed a state statute that prohibits a civilian oversight entity from having subpoena power in the state of Tennessee. So again, we're seeing some backlash occurring here that's trying to sort of tamp down the scope and power of civilian oversight entities. In Newark, that police department, coming out of the consent decree, created their own civilian review board. Immediately, the police union pushed back, took them to court, and tried to argue that the powers of this entity were in violation of the officers' due process rights, and that because they didn't think that the civilians would actually be fair. They thought they would just sort of take their own side. That litigation finally was resolved just earlier this year, and the court said, absolutely not. This is perfectly fine. Civilians can be fair and neutral, and they really upheld most of that entity's powers. In Chicago here, of course, we're no different. The FOP has pushed back from a variety of fronts. They tried to intervene in the lawsuit that created the consent decree, and they tried to sort of influence a lot of the elements of the consent decree through litigation. And so that is an ongoing battle between the union and the city and the parties to that lawsuit. So we're always seeing police unions pushing back. And then the last slide, Richard. So when we look at civilian oversight as a whole, in my view, looking back and historically and seeing what's happened over the course of the decades that it's been in existence, and then also looking at the more recent challenges we faced, these are what I would consider to be the key success factors for civilian oversight. The first thing is to have the proper jurisdictional scope. Many entities, when they were first created, they were only allowed to investigate what the superintendent, for example, would say was okay. They would say, oh, the superintendent could say, oh, go investigate this case, that's fine. So they didn't have any formal jurisdiction. So that's really important. The second thing is resources. Many of these agencies have failed over time because they were not given the resources that they need to actually completely deliver on their mission. And so they failed because they couldn't keep up with the caseload and they couldn't handle the work in a quality way. A third thing is access to information and witnesses. So critical here is subpoena power and also unfettered access to police department policies. There was a time when these entities would have to ask the police department for the reports about an incident. So unfettered access and direct access to information and materials is really important. Of course, structural independence is also important. We need to ensure that these entities are structurally separated from the police department so that they can operate and function completely independently. Professionalism has also emerged as a really important aspect. These entities require individuals and professionals who are trained to do the tasks that they're given to do. So if they're investigators, they need to have the proper training to investigate these kinds of matters. They need the proper legal understanding of all the legal constraints because the legal landscape is pretty complex. So professional is important. Neutrality is important too. If you have a body that is constantly seen as favoring one side over the other, then it engenders mistrust from the other side of the equation and is constantly going to be challenged. So for example, here in Chicago, the Independent Police Review Authority was widely viewed as being too cozy with the police department. And so the community members never really believed in the outcome of their cases because they always felt that they were biased towards the officer. So neutrality is important. And then of course, the last thing is transparency. These agencies cannot engender trust of the community if they're not forthcoming with their work product. And so transparency has been a challenge because there are some places where actually state law inhibits how transparent they can be. So we see movements toward creating more transparency and removing some of the barriers of transparency that exist with regard to civilian oversight. So that's where I'm going to leave it with you, and I'm going to turn it over to Jonathan.
Okay, let me first offer an introduction for my colleague, Jonathan Masur, the John P. Wilson Professor of Law. Professor Masur received degrees in physics and political science from Stanford University, his JD from Harvard Law School. He clerked for Chief Judge Marilyn Patel of the Northern District of California and for our own Judge Richard Posner here in the Seventh Circuit. And since joining the law school in 2007, Professor Masur's research and teaching interests have included, among many things, administrative law and criminal law. Professor Masur.
Thank you, Jonathan. And thank you, everyone, for joining us. It's a pleasure to be here. And I think, as Jonathan said, this is a
are you, there we go.
Thank you, Richard. I want to say sort of two quick things, kind of building off of the points that Professor Fairley made, especially in that last slide. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about the University of Chicago's police department as well, because I think it provides a sort of nice contrast and another way to think about what we mean when we talk about civilian control of the police. So the first thing I want to say is really just to amplify something that Professor Fairley said in reference to the last slide, which is that I think a lot of the discussion about civilian control of police has centered on formal structures and formal mechanisms. What board exists, who precisely has the power to conduct investigations or decide on discipline or whatever. But in point of fact, the informal mechanisms of control and the particular sort of cultures and selection of members and biases within the existing organizations can be just as important, if not much more important. So as Professor Fairley pointed out, Chicago has had civilian, what we would say on paper is civilian control of the police for quite a long time, but a lot of that time period has been marked by criticism that those instruments of control are too cozy with the police. And so a lot of the proposals that we see in the sort of Civilian Police Accountability Council, this new set of proposals for CPAC that are pending before the Chicago City Council, are sort of mechanisms of trying to change the informal structures and the informal ways in which civilians exert control over police activity. And so Professor Fairley highlighted one of those, which is a sort of greater level of community responsiveness. Instead of a lot of this being channeled through the mayor, one single individual, you would have multiple members on the council elected from different policing districts across the city, and who are then presumably more responsive to the interests of their particular districts. In addition, the CPAC, the membership would by design would have a different sort of orientation. So Professor Fairley highlighted that none of the members can have any kind of policing background. In addition, at least one version of the pending ordinance would require that the only people who could become members of CPAC are people who have either experience or expertise in protecting the rights of minorities or protecting people against police violence. So there's a very sort of explicit attempt in law now to change sort of the character of the institution, not by changing the formal structure, but by changing kind of the makeup and the personnel of that institution. And then the CPAC would then have the authority to select members of the police board, which is the institution that has sort of final decision authority over discipline for police. And then that would presumably change the membership of the police board, type of people who make up that organization as well. Okay, so point number two. So basically, Professor Fairley's discussion was about what we might think of as sort of civil sanctions against police, talking about sort of police discipline in the form of suspension and potential firing and that sort of thing, in addition to sort of the making of rules and regulations for the police force. But we could think of another channel of civilian control of the police as being the criminal channel, the criminal prosecution of police officers who engage in unsanctioned violence or just sort of general illegitimate deprivation of civilians' rights. And there too, what we have here is sort of nominal, kind of formal civilian control. We have a criminal justice apparatus headed by, in Chicago, the Cook County State's Attorney, but across the country, lots of civilian, often elected prosecutors that is outside of the police hierarchy. And so we might normally expect that that would be an effective mode of civilian control of the police. In practice, of course, we know that those modes of control have not been especially effective, and that prosecutors have been very reluctant to bring cases against the police. And a very simple reason for that is that prosecutors are dependent upon the police to provide them with evidence and witnesses and bring them casework. And so it can be very politically challenging for a prosecutor to go after the same police department. It's sort of that they're relying on. It's this is biting the hand that feeds you from the prosecutor's perspective. That was a big part of the accusations leveled against Anita Alvarez, the Cook County State's Attorney, who lost her job in part because she was seen as not aggressively trying to prosecute the officers who killed and then covered up the shooting of Laquan McDonald. It's no surprise that cities that have their policing tactics investigated in a large sense often that investigation comes from another jurisdiction. So Chicago is under a consent decree about its policing. That consent decree is federal. It's a federal investigation brought by people who are, who do not depend on the Chicago Police Department in the same fashion. So I think that when we think about civilian control, we should also sort of think about creating separate offices of prosecutors who are in no way dependent upon the police for their work and livelihood, and then who have the capacity and the authority to bring criminal cases against the police where they think it's warranted without fear that that's going to sort of harm the work that they're trying to do elsewhere. So again, it's a point about sort of formal methods of supervision versus sort of informal channels of control. Okay, I have a few slides also. I'm going to transition now to talk about the UCPD very briefly. Richard, could you put up my, my set of slides, please? Okay. Excellent, thanks. I think you can advance it to the first one. So, so I just want to sort of outline kind of how the University of Chicago Police Department works and think about what we mean by civilian control in the context of an organization like this. So the UCPD has been sort of sworn and deputized by the police of the, by the state of Illinois and by the police forces in Illinois, such that they have the full suite of police powers that CPD have within their jurisdiction. And so UCPD is its own police force, its own entity, and it's headed by a chief of police, who at this point is Mr. Kenton Rainey. Next slide, please, Richard. The UCPD and the chief of police, they report to the associate vice president for safety and security. So someone within the office of the president of the university, and that position is currently occupied by Eric Keith. Eric Keith has a law enforcement background himself, but he is not himself a member of the University of Chicago Police Department. He is, an associate vice president, just as we have many other associate vice presidents and associate provosts and so forth who handle other sorts of jobs. And so he is the civilian who sort of literally oversees the UCPD. Next slide, please, Richard. And then he in turn reports directly to the president of the university, at this moment, Bob Zimmer. So again, in a sort of very formal sense, you have civilian control of the UCPD flowing through the associate vice president for safety and security and then to the president. Okay, next slide, please, Richard. So matters of discipline and accusations of, sort of violations of rights, again, all the sort of civil control of the police, all of that runs through someone whose official title is the executive director for campus safety, although we sort of know him just as the investigator. And currently the office is occupied by Mr. Mike Kwiatkowski. And essentially, when any civilian brings a complaint against the University of Chicago Police Department, that complaint is immediately referred to Mr. Kwiatkowski, to the executive director for campus safety. And he does not report to the UCPD. Could you hit the next slide, please, Richard? So he receives civilian complaints when they are filed, and his reporting is directly to the Associate Vice President for Safety and Security. So you have an investigator whose job it is to oversee the police and who is outside of the UCPD chain of command. He reports directly to the civilian in the office of the Associate Vice President. And he delivers his reports to the Associate Vice President, and then Mr. Heath, the Associate Vice President, he has the final say on what disciplinary measures will be imposed upon UCPD per the investigation conducted by Mike Kwiatkowski. So the other important body here is, Richard, if you could hit the next slide, please, the Independent Review Committee. So this is a body made up of students, staff at the university, some faculty, and also community members. I was chair of this committee from 2016 to 2019. Richard McAdams was chair of this committee for a number of years before that. I believe that they just pick whoever seems like the most senior person at the law school who knows anything about police or administrative structure to run this committee. So I think that's how I was chosen. So the Independent Review Committee, the job of the Independent Review Committee is to review the decisions that are made by the Associate Vice President for Safety and Security in consultation with the investigator, the executive director for campus safety. So when a disciplinary matter has been brought, it's investigated by Mike Kwiatkowski. He makes a report to Eric Heath. Eric Heath makes a final decision on what to do with that report, and then that goes to the Independent Review Committee. And our entire role in the Independent Review Committee is to decide whether we think Eric Heath got it right. And we have no actual formal power to change or override the decision. We have no capacity to discipline police officers or to change their discipline in any way. The capacity is purely sort of a kind of totally like outside civilian review of the decision to determine whether we think the decision was correct. So if you could just hit the next and last slide, please. So we have sort of, we have informal reporting from the Associate Vice President, no sort of formal oversight authority. And then our report every year, the Independent Review Committee, I keep saying our, even though I'm no longer on it, every year the Independent Review Committee writes a report which goes to the president. And that report sort of details the various complaints that were brought that year, the disciplinary measures that Eric Keith imposed, and the Independent Review Committee's view of whether those disciplinary measures were correct or not. And so the goal of the Independent Review Committee is to sort of increase the level of transparency about these complaints in a pretty modest way, because the complaints themselves are not made public, and the report that we write about the complaint preserves the confidentiality of the officers and the complainants involved, but in some way to sort of try to share that information. Okay, so I guess the last thing I'll say is, so this is obviously a pretty different structure than we see from the CPD, and the UCPD obviously is by no means a perfect institution, but it certainly seems to behave very differently than the CPD. And so I think that one thing that's worth thinking about when we talk about civilian control again is, to what extent do we think that structures are the factors that matter, and to what extent do we think it's the culture of the institution or the particular people who are guiding it, or even the civilian population that organization has to answer to, that are the most important factors. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, John, Professor Masur. So now we will move to the Q&A portion of today's session, and I already have received a great many questions through the chat function, and you should feel free to add those questions. I thought I would begin with maybe I can combine 3 questions here, but we have a question from someone who wanted to know the basic premise, why civilian control? Is civilian control good? And are there any costs to civilian control, to transparency? One question related here, I think, is how can we define success for civilian control? When do we know that it's not working? When do we know that it is working? Is there some way that we could measure it? Is there some way we could say it's failing in Chicago, but it's working in some other city, so that we could, if we knew success versus failure, then we could say, oh well, let's do what those cities that are succeeding more are doing, and we would have some empirical basis for thinking that one mechanism is more likely to work than another. So either Professor, yes. Let me ask the speakers here not to unmute themselves if they can help it, because I have to unmute you then. Yes.
Okay, I think I can start with that. So the issue of the why civilian oversight is, its foundation really is in the basic concepts of democracy, and the idea is that we give to our government the power to police and we instill in them these powers that are really, really important, right? The power to take someone's liberty, the power to take someone's life. And so the idea for civilian oversight is we want some degree of say in how our government uses those powers that we as a community have given them. So I think that's really the origin. And then to get to the last question is, like, what does success look like? This is, I think, one of the biggest questions for civilian oversight for eternity, because what we see happening, and this is over the course of decades, is we have a scandal, we implement some reforms, we tinker with the system, and then we go about our way. But the problem is the next scandal happens, and then there's still not enough trust in the system. We feel like we have to reform the system again. And of course, Chicago's the poster child for that, right? So we have the Chicago Police Board that was created out of the Summerdale scandal in 1960. We went about a decade, and then we had all the police brutality from the Democratic National Convention in 1968 and those riots. We had the raid on the Black Panther apartment where Fred Hampton was killed. And that created a new set of crises that created more calls for civilian oversight, right? And so that's when the department created what was called the Office of Professional Services. So taking some of the investigative responsibilities away from internal affairs and giving it to this civilian-based group of people to investigate, for example, incidents of use of force. So that's when we first had that separate entity to investigate those kinds of incidents. In 2008, there was yet another scandal. This time there was a big video of an officer beating up a bartender. And that's when IPRA was created, the Independent Police Review Authority, right? And then of course, fast forward to 2015, we have the Laquan McDonald crisis. And again, the whole system was redone. We created the Civilian Office of Police Accountability and the Public Safety Inspector General. So we have this cycle, and we're not the only ones. This scandal reform repeat, scandal reform repeat. So the question for civilian oversight is, how can you create a sustainably effective system that can withstand these scandals over time? And so to me, it's all about creating a system in which there is trust, and trust on both sides of the equation. Trust in the community that it's going to do the right thing. These things are going to be investigated in a quality way, and officers are going to be held accountable consistently and effectively. Trust in the officers that they're going to get a fair shake. Because if we don't have the officers think that they're going to constantly be railroaded, who's going to take the job, right? Nobody's going to want to take that job. So it's all about trust. And so I think that's a very difficult thing to measure, but I think that's really what's at the crux of the issue.
I think that was. I don't have much to add to that answer.
Okay, all right. Let me ask this. Let me ask a question that comes partly just for myself, which is, why? It seems to me that we might think of civilian control and discipline of police alongside the civilian control and discipline of other public employees. And the one that comes to my mind often are teachers. And we've had some questions about police unions and collective bargaining agreements and how they constrain efforts to discipline police, to suspend or fire police. But it's we also have teachers unions, and so I guess it is my impression that if a teacher is found to have behaved very badly, to have misbehaved, to have slapped a student or said something horrible and offensive to a student, I guess it's my impression, and maybe I don't know enough about this because I'm more a policing person, that such a teacher can be successfully fired. And yet it seems like for the police it's quite different, and that when many police officers in Chicago, in Minneapolis, turn out to be involved in some viral killing, that it turns out it's not the first or second or third or fourth time that they've been that there's been a citizen complaint against them about excessive force. And so I guess my perception is that it's harder to discipline police than it is to discipline other government employees. We are going to talk about police unions next week. I'm going to be talking about that topic, but I still note that teachers are unionized. So anyway, that's my question. Is it unproven that it's easier to have civilian control of teachers, or if you accept that it's the case, why is it the case that it's harder to control discipline the police?
Do you want me to take that one?
Sure. It's up to you. I can if you.
Why don't you go ahead, please? Yeah.
So I think so. Part of the challenge is that we have baked into the legal structure around police discipline, police accountability systems, several impediments to holding police officers accountable. So if you look back historically, so first of all, it's important to understand, where policing comes from, right? I mean, if you look back historically, policing was very, very political. At the turn of the century, when these municipal police departments were just getting off the ground, they were basically controlled by the political elite. There was complete ties between policing and local politics, right? And so over the course of time, there became this concern when policing tried to distance themselves from that, when they tried to become a more professional profession, right? I don't know how to say it. They wanted to break that tie. And so what you see happening in the 1970s is you have a number of legal structures put into place to protect police from political retribution. And so you have what's called these law enforcement officer Bill of Rights statutes at the state level that happen. And then of course, then you also started to see these protections built into collective bargaining agreements. And they sort of started in this vein of, how can we protect our officers from, political action, punishment, right? But at the end of the day is that those systems and those mechanisms ultimately became a huge impediment to being able to hold officers accountable. So it might start with sort of some basic due process things, which are reasonable, right? If an officer is going to be accused of misconduct, he should be, have a right to be given notice and an opportunity to be heard. But then they sort of exploded from there with all these other protections that are now, inappropriate in the wake of the challenges that we see in terms of holding officers accountable. Does that help?
I would just add, I think it's unproven that it's easier to fire unionized public school teachers than it is to fire police. So a typical large school district like the Chicago Public Schools or the New York Public Schools, a school district of that size will typically fire something like somewhere between 1 in 1,000 to 1 in 10,000 of its teachers, in a given 2 to 3 year period. So, obviously it might be that all the teachers are doing a great job and nobody needs to be fired, but the incredibly sort of low rate at which public school teachers are fired is some piece of evidence that it's not very easy to do so. And in fact, there's quite a lot of evidence that teachers are often sort of treated the way police officers are treated. A bad teacher will be shuffled from one school to another or from one piece of the district to another to avoid having to fire that person. The process can be very, very lengthy, take years at a time during which the teacher is on paid leave and so on and so forth. So I do think that process can be quite challenging. I mean, perhaps one very significant difference between the two, if there is a difference, is that there appears to be much more of a sort of culture of solidarity and of protecting one's own within the police department than there is within the teaching ranks. And people who are in teaching leadership do not seem, at least as an anecdotal matter, to take the same sort of permissive attitude towards all of the actions of their subordinates as people in the police hierarchy are sort of typically thought to do. So structurally, I think these two entities are not quite as different as we might imagine. And as a matter of kind of culture and norms, that's probably where the largest differences lie.
Yeah, okay. I guess it depends on what you mean by a bad teacher, because I think of merely an ineffective teacher who's uninspiring as being different from one who struck a student without any reason. And I guess I don't have any proof that it's easy to fire a teacher who physically assaulted a student. But my impression is not that. I just anecdotally don't read about stories of teachers who do something horrible and then it turns out they've used excessive force on apparently many times in the past.
There are lots of those sorts of anecdotal stories. I mean, I think, without knowing the denominator of how many teachers exactly have engaged in that sort of behavior, it's hard to assess statistics.
Okay.
But there were a spate of stories, in the mid-2000s about teachers who would show up. I don't know about violence in particular, but teachers who would show up to class drunk, teachers who would engage in sexual harassment, teachers who engage in racial harassment, et cetera, and who would not be fired for periods of years and years, and often were able to retain their jobs.
Okay, well, you did mention one thing, which I do expect we'll talk about next week, which is the code of silence, and maybe it will come up every week. but it as a distinction here, I agree with you. I'm not sure there's any group of employees or any profession that has such a powerful code of silence as the police do, even though sometimes other professions or occupations are said to have one. Let me move to a different and obvious set of questions in some ways maybe the most important, which is, what should we be doing in detail? So we have this recently reformed police accountability organization, COPA. Right now, throughout the United States and in Chicago, there's this proposal of CPAC, which some of the people here have asked about. And one of the questioners pointed out to a different acronym, which apparently Mayor Lightfoot is for, GAPA. And the Congress is considering some police reforms. And so I guess I'm wondering, Professor Fairley, if you could kind of address what are the differences in these, I mean, to some extent your opening remarks did this, but what are the differences? What is the mayor trying to do? And what are the most important institutional details in your view? If you could change, both of you, if you could change three things, within the oversight organizations of city police, what would it be?
Okay, well, let me unpack that a little bit, right? So looking at the system that we have right now, there are still a number of impediments to effectiveness in the current system. There are still issues with the way that the Civilian Office of Police Accountability, or COPA, operates, the police board operates, that I think still need to be fixed. Even though those entities or that system is still somewhat newly created, it's only been in place since 2016, there are still some structural impediments to accountability that need to be removed. Here's an example. When the COPA chief makes a recommendation about a disciplinary matter, it is merely a recommendation, and the superintendent can accept or reject it. And if the superintendent and the COPA chief don't agree, and they cannot reach a resolution, then that matter is transmitted to a single person in the Chicago Police Board, who then decides which side they're going to take. Now, in the case of serious matters like an officer-involved shooting, I don't think that a single person of the Chicago Police Board should have the power to derail a completely and effectively done COPA investigation that resulted in a finding that the officer did something wrong. So that's just one thing that I think needs to be fixed, right? The other thing is that when the police board adjudicates their matters, I think that some of their procedural mechanisms are not as equitable as they could be. Here's an example. When a case goes before the police board about an officer, there's a hearing that's conducted, and the evidence about the officer's guilt or whether or not he did something wrong is presented all along with the evidence of whether or how seriously he should be punished, right? So we have all this evidence that's being presented to the board about what happened, who was on first, blah, blah, blah. And then at the end of the hearing, you have the officer's wife and his, partners and his supervisors coming and say, he's such a great guy. He's just really does a great job. And the hearing board hears all of that before they determine whether the officer did something wrong. And of course, it's part of our, justice tradition that we bifurcate those decisions. We only hear evidence of guilt before we determine guilt, and then we hear evidence that's relevant to how the officer should be punished. And so that's just an example of where there's a problem with the system. So I think there are still problems with the underlying system that need to be fixed before we add something on top of it that's going to complicate things even further. So there's a lot of debate about what powers this new oversight entity will have. GAPA is the organization that originally created the first proposal, and that proposal was very different than the one that's really on the table now before the city council. That proposal had a creation of elected panels for each district, and those elected officials would then select 7 people to be on the oversight board. So structurally, it was a very different proposal. So again, we have to start parsing through exactly what we want this board to be, what powers we want are important to give it, and then how do we, implement that across as a structure that works effectively to oversee the rest of the system that resides below it.
I'll give you 3 quick things. I certainly co-sign everything that Professor Fairley just said. 3 quick things. So number 1, if we're going to have a body like the police board that has sort of disciplinary authority, certainly I think it should be the entire body, not just one single member who's making these decisions. I would also, since the body is so important and the idea is that it'd be responsive to the community, I would move to a sort of directly elected police board, or at least a police board where the selection of members is being made by a directly elected body who have that as one of their few functions, as would occur under the CPAC proposal. I think right now the selection of police board members is insufficiently transparent and too small of a piece of the overall set of responsibilities of the mayor for the democratic process to really hold those people fully accountable. Secondly, and per some of the remarks I made at the beginning, I would have prosecutors outside of the state's attorney's office answerable only to the Attorney General of the state of Illinois, whose responsibility is to investigate police misconduct and to bring criminal charges against police. And I would give them, their own budget, their own investigators, et cetera, all of that controlled outside of the budget of any kind of the normal criminal justice apparatus that actually has to work with the police. Similar to how, police departments have internal affairs divisions, but even more separate. And then thirdly, this isn't really a structural reform, but it's another tool. I would recommend the creation of extremely significant penalties, both civil and criminal, against police officers who lie to investigators, who file false reports, and so forth. We know at this point that the sort of code of silence is a huge part of the problem, and that however many structural reforms we have, it's often very, very hard to pierce the actual cases of wrongdoing without police officers being willing to tell the truth and cooperate with investigators. And right now, a lot of police think that the cost of cooperating is going to be higher than the benefits to them. The cost of cooperating is often that they'll be drummed out of the force, or that other police will try to put them in harm's way or something like that. But the whole culture around the code of silence needs to change if there's going to be meaningful reform. And I would think that very harsh penalties themselves, I don't know how much sort of deterrent impact that would be, but one would hope that it would change the culture within policing in which every police officer is supposed to stick up for every other officer by making it clear that, hey, if you do something illegal, you're now putting me in a position where sticking up for you means making false statements that could put me in an enormous amount of legal jeopardy. So your illegal actions are actually a grave impediment to me as your fellow officer. And thus, our culture now is that you're not supposed to put that on me because of the legal risk that it would create for me. So I think that really trying to sort of crack down on the code of silence would conceivably have significant ripple effects throughout the department that would be beneficial.
Professor Masur, could I ask you to think about this in the context of the UCPD? We had a couple of questions about that. Is there sufficient civilian oversight of the UCPD? Does it have, is it important not to have more transparency than there is? As you said, we don't, the public reports don't identify the officers who were accused by the civilians in the complaint.
Yeah, I think that more transparency there would be a very good idea. I understand, as I have been informed that part of the reason for the kind of anonymity of a lot of it currently is to protect the confidentiality of the complainants. And that seems right to me. It seems if you file a complaint, you should be allowed to remain anonymous unless you want to waive that right and have your name and the circumstances of your complaint made public and so forth. But I'm not sure that there's any need for that to apply to the police officers who are accused of violating rights. So I don't see why very large proportions of the reports and investigations that are filed couldn't be made public. The independent review committee is authorized to release each year statistics on things like how many officers over the course of their tenure have had more than X number of complaints against them. You know, we've had X number of officers with 5 complaints and Y number of officers with 4 complaints, and so on and so forth. But they don't disclose the names of those officers or exactly what those complaints were about or how those complaints were adjudicated. And so I do think that a substantial additional degree of transparency would be valuable. And then the citizen population here could, in effect, perform the same function that the independent review committee is performing, which is it could review the complaints and could review their disposition and could decide for themselves whether the UCPD is being, sort of properly managed and controlled by the president of the university and the associate vice president, or whether there are changes that should be made. And I should say as well that I think that transparency would be to the benefit of the UCPD in many respects. The UCPD is far from perfect, but on the whole, it does not engage in the level or the type of violence that the City of Chicago Police Department engages in. There are many fewer citizen complaints each year against the UCPD, and especially many fewer complaints about very serious actions by officers of the UCPD. And so I do think that in some ways, the UCPD is harming its own mission by trying to cloak itself too much in this sort of veil of secrecy. And I think that quite a lot more transparency would probably be beneficial from all directions.
If I could just add to that or build on that. And so just from what Professor Masur described as the system that's in place here for UCPD, it's really what we would consider the review model of oversight, where you have a separate entity that's, again, reviewing an investigation of misconduct that's been conducted, and then sort of assessing it and just determining whether or not they agree with it. And that can be an effective form of oversight, but it's most effective when there's transparency about it. Because the whole point of having that body make that assessment is to be able to share it, right? Because if that assessment goes nowhere, then there's no way it impacts the system. The point of when you have a review model like that is to have transparency around it, so the public gets that information and can say, wow, that's crazy. That investigation wasn't done well. And then they can put pressure on the president to make a change. So that's why transparency is really critical.
Well, I was just going to say, I think we're out of time. Thank you, Professor Masur. Thank you, Professor Fairley. Thank you, attendees. There are a lot of other great questions I didn't get to, but some of these we'll get to in the future. Like there were some questions about unions, and next week, Professor Marianne Case and I will be the experts, and Professor Emily Buss will be the moderator host again, and the topic is police culture, training, and unions. So I hope to see many of you then, and we'll get to some of the questions we didn't get to today.
Thanks, everyone.
Great to see you all. Thank you.